start again. Antony is going to give us this talk about the collaboration between the British Museum and Czechoslovak National Gallery in the 1980s. And if you don't know, I'm Peter Jameson. I'm the chairman of the Friends of Czech Heritage. Firstly, I must thank the ambassador and his staff for allowing us to use this the theatre once again. We're very, very grateful to them. Just before I start, I just want to mention so-called forthcoming events. In fact, actually, we haven't really sorted out our programme for next year, although we do have two excursions. One is the delayed walk around London looking at Czech buildings by Czech architects, which was unfortunately postponed because of the tube strike. And that will now take place in April, we hope. And then there's also another tour in the summer, which is going to be to various country houses in Sussex. Oh, sorry, sorry. To introduce Antony, I think you've seen the blurb, but basically he studied at Oxford University and then went on to study at the Courtauld. And following that, he had a position in the British Museum in the Department of Prints and Drawings, and he eventually became the keeper of the Prints and Drawings collection. He's also been the Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford University and a trustee of the Art Fund and is a trustee of the Henry Moore Foundation and is a fellow of the British Academy. So he's pretty well qualified. However, nowhere in Wikipedia does it mention his involvement with the Czechoslovak estate, and I'm hoping that he's now going to enliven us about what he did with the Czechoslovak state in the 1980s. Thank you very much.
Now, first thing, can you hear me if I speak like this?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
All right, that's problem number one solved. I haven't thought about Prague and my time in Czechoslovakia for decades, so what you're going to listen to now is the ashes of a memory, and whatever I can dredge up. You have Hannah Lang entirely to blame for this, because I once started talking about this at a dinner party, and that's why I've been summoned along here. My involvement with Prague falls into three distinct acts, if you like. And I'll just explain what they are to give you some sort of sense of perspective. First was an exchange of exhibitions devoted to Václav Venceslas Hollar. That was in 83, roughly. So that was the first. The second one, which followed from it, was in 86, which was an exchange of collections with Prague, which I'll come to. And the third, which is very much a postscript, was in 2000, when we lent a William Blake exhibition to Prague. The starting point for the first one, the Hollar exhibition, was a cultural agreement signed in 1981 between the British government and the Czech government. That was a sort of the depths of the, well, not depths, it's always worse, but it's a very bad period, and the cultural agreements seem to be about the only thing that anyone could agree on. So an agreement was signed. I knew, of course, nothing whatever about this. And the first I knew was when I was summoned in by the director in 81, with that sort of smile in his face, which directors have when they're giving you news that they know you don't want to hear, to say that the cultural agreement included an exchange, a joint exhibition with Prague of Hollar as an artist to straddle both Czech and British history. Well, that went down over the lead balloon like me. I thought, my God, you know, how on earth am I going to cope with this? I had joined the department in 1976, so I'd only been there 5 years. At Oxford, I had studied classics. I'd done a couple of years at the Courtauld, doing Italian High Renaissance art. I then got a job to look after all the prints in the British Museum, which is a bizarre, crazy job, because that meant I had about 2 million objects to look after, and the rest of the staff had about 50,000. Anyway, so that qualified me to do a horror exhibition. I had heard of horror, I hasten to say. So that was that. I had just actually been promoted deputy keeper, so I owed something to the director. Anyway, I had no position to refuse, so that was what happened. There was actually a second exhibition, which I had nothing whatever to do with, of Greater Moravia, where, also in the BM, which is on the back of this same exchange. My knowledge of Czech history was zero. The only thing I do remember very vividly about Czech history was being a 17-year-old in Edinburgh, where my father had taken me and my brother up to the Edinburgh Festival to try and educate us a bit. We didn't have any television at home, so having a television in Edinburgh was quite a treat. We borrowed a flat from someone. And of course, what was all over the news was the film of the Russian occupation of Prague, which I remember horrified me at the time. So that was what I knew about Prague. And I should also perhaps at this point say who it was I was dealing with in Prague. The director was a man called Kotelik. I'll come back to him. My opposite number, the one I did the exhibition with, was Gabriela Kesnerova. And the person I knew best, or came to know best, was her husband, Ladislav Kestner. Since the Czechs couldn't come to London, I had to go to Prague to make the arrangements. So off I went. And I was dreading it. I didn't know what was going to happen. In fact, it was dead easy because the Czechs were very, very encouraging and very helpful. And we quickly agreed that we were going to have the same exhibition in both cities. That in Prague it would have Czech prints, in London it would have English prints. English, I mean ones that belonged to the museum. We both had very good collections, so we didn't need to change the prints. But what we would do is it swapped the drawings. And so we lent 21 drawings, if I remember correctly, to each side. And that was going to be the exhibition. The catalogue was written jointly. I did, I think, 3 sections. Gabriela did 2. And it was published both in Czech and in English. And in fact, this is the catalogue. So I arrived in Prague by plane, knowing nothing, to find when I landed that the airport was surrounded by tanks with their guns pointing at the runway. So that was a nice, friendly introduction. I'll talk a bit more about the exhibition first, then I'll go back to my memories of Prague. As I say, the arrangements are very straightforward. I can't remember how we transported the things to London. That wasn't my concern. I do remember transporting the crates to Prague because it was a Czech plane which didn't have any hold for the luggage. It was just the back part of the fuselage, the main fuselage. So the chairs ran out, and then there's an empty space, and that's where we put these quite big boxes because they're quite large prints, long prints. They were all stacked up there. We got to Prague, everyone got off the plane. I thought I'd better stay with my boxes, and nothing happened. There wasn't at all clear what was supposed to happen. And eventually 2 baggage handlers turned up on one of those forklift trucks. And so I said, obviously looked rather surprised to find me, so I sort of said, So they put the cases onto the forks of the forklift. I sat on top, and we sort of careered across to the terminal, at which point they said that they put the crates onto the baggage carrier, which took everything up there, and I was directed there. So nothing I could do except go there. And so that was going through the immigration. And of course at the top was all the people from the National Gallery in Prague who were not allowed anywhere near the tarmac. So that was that. And then from then on, everything went very smoothly indeed. In fact, I have very few memories of that. But I'll talk a bit about Prague. The Prague I remember when I first got there. And I'm conflating here memories of several trips, I guess. It was an extraordinary place. The first evening I arrived, the British Council people there, who are very good, looked after me and took me to a restaurant, which was just on the old side, just the other side of the castle side of the bridge. You know, that lower bit on the left as you go over the bridge. And we got there, went there by car. It was one of those evenings where the mist had come up from the river, and it was shrouded in this sort of misty fog. There's a few lights, dimly, you could see. Not a person in sight. We drew up outside a door which gave no indication at all of what it was, but it turned out to be the restaurant. So we went in, and there indeed was a restaurant. At which point I was then asked, have you brought the Western cigarettes with you? So I had. That's fine, they said, you put them on your side plate and put the napkin above it. So I did. At which point the waiter came, removed it, brought back the plate minus the cigarettes. At which point we got served. So I explained, I asked them what was this about, and they said, well, this is a mixture of British Council and Czech friends. They said, well, these guys are all paid anyway, so there's no need for them to bother to serve us. So the only way you can do it is to bring along a bribe, which would, encourage them to do something. So we had a nice meal, and that was that. I also remember going to the hotel where I was staying, where there's a big coach party, disembarking from a coach. And I asked the taxi driver, who had a few words of English, who are they? And he said, Ruski, and spat out of the window. So that gave you a fairly clear local view of that. It was very extraordinary. The town itself looked absolutely wonderful. Half of it was ruined. I mean, there was building after building which was derelict. And that was explained to me because they're all owned by the state who couldn't be bothered to maintain it. I remember walking around on a Sunday morning in the sort of the old part where there's absolutely no one around. And at one point a door opened and someone came and shook out a mat and the door shut again. And that was the only person I saw in about an hour. It was a sort of ghost town. I mean, not in the main streets, of course, I'm talking about the sort of the residential areas. The person I got to know, as I mentioned, was Ladislav Kessner, the husband of my co-author. And for me, he's the sort of the Czech who I most admired, extraordinary man. I think he's no longer alive. He never writes to anyone, so I wrote, he never got a reply. He had been a man I discovered from people in British Council who had in 1968 torn up his party card and sent it back. The result was he'd been in charge, the number 2, I think, in the National Gallery, and Kotelik, who was the director, was, I was told, instructed to get rid of him. And Kotelik, who was a man I had a lot of respect for, didn't. he sort of simply demoted him and hid him in some research institute in the basement, and then gradually sort of brought him up as the years passed. And by the time I knew him, he was in charge of the St. Agnes Cloister, is that the right name? The early Czech paintings, which he'd done very well. And he gave me his views about Czech history. He said, I remember that the only intelligent ruler this country's ever had, he said, was Charles IV. And then another day he said, if you want to understand this country, you have to regard it as a mixture of Kafka and Zweig, which I thought was a wonderful characterization, or at least in those days. Anyway, so we had that exhibition in the Holler exhibition in Prague, and then we had it in London, and that was fine. And in fact, the whole thing worked rather well. And my director and Cotterley got on very well together. They both, I think, drank like fish. And the result of that was the next plot that was hatched, which was to have a show of modern Czech prints in London and modern British prints in Prague. And we were at that point a fairly rich organisation. It sounds an extraordinary thing to say, but in those days, wait for it, the purchase grant for the museum was 1.4 million. The purchase grant today is 60,000. That's a change in the museums. And so there was actually a bit of cash around. However, that cash couldn't be used to make a collection. And because what we wanted to do was to make a Czech collection for the British Museum to go along with the American collection, the German, the French collections, which we were building up. And we knew we didn't have a hope in hell of doing it unless we had, in effect, unless it's done for us by the Czechs. So the idea then became we would actually exchange collections. We would make a collection in London, and the Czechs would make a collection in Prague, and we would simply swap ownership, show each collection in the respective city, and that would sort of be something which would last the future. And I thought it was a rather good idea, so I was very much in favour of it, and I trusted the Czechs completely by that stage. So that's what happened. And I, of course, was having to form the British collection to go to Prague, and that, of course, was very difficult because the public money could not be spent on something which is going to be given away. So I managed, or the director managed to get a sum out of the British Museum Society, in other words, Friends of the British Museum. And I can't quite remember what it was, but I think it was 25,000, maybe a bit less. Anyway, it wasn't nearly enough, as you might imagine. And I could eke it out with a number of duplicates we had in our collection. We pushed it back to Turner, so a slightly longer timescale. It wasn't just 20th century. And so we got numerically, I think it's 107 prints, but the Czechs really did a fantastic job, and I was really quite startled when the stuff arrived, because it really was a very, very good collection indeed. And I felt terribly embarrassed because I knew our collection wasn't of that standard at all. I mean, it wasn't a bad one. I'd done the best I could, but I didn't have enough money to do it. I chucked in a few things I owned myself to try and beef it up, but it was really, really quite difficult. But when it came to London, I suddenly realised, of course, from the Czech point of view, it wasn't really an exchange of collection at all. What they wanted was to have a really good collection of Czech art in London. And what came to Prague was rather less important. So we made a good catalogue, which is this one. And of course, I was quite incompetent to write any catalogue on Czech prints, and we found Irena Goldscheider, who was then living in London, Czech emigre. And I never quite understood when and how she came out, but anyway, she was living up in Colindale, which seemed to be full of Czechs. She did a very good job in the catalogue, and I was very grateful to her. And I was hoping she might be here this evening, but I was Googling to try and find out what had happened, because I kept up with her for about 10 years, then we lost touch. And I discovered she died a couple of years ago, poor thing. So I was upset about that. Anyway, so that was that catalogue, and the one which went to Prague was this one, which has an introduction by me on the history of English prints, which is, of course, in Czech. It's translated by them, and for me it's completely inscrutable, because this was done in the days before word processors, so I don't have any English copy of it at all, so I have no idea what it is I said. However, I'm sure it was a long time ago and it's well worth forgetting, so I'm very happy not to be able to see what I made of it. So that was the exchange of exhibitions. I can't remember if it was that exhibition or the previous one, which was, had the full diplomatic, I think probably the latter one, had the full diplomatic works, and there was a dinner after the opening in the British Embassy in Prague, which is, well, still is, I trust, the British Embassy. It's a wonderful building, I loved it. The ambassador was a man called Rich, I think. Anyway, it's very nice. And he said, I remember when I first went there, he said, "No, don't say anything. We assume this is bugged, so be very careful what you say." So that was that. Then we had the dinner, which was half Czech, half English. Some of the Czechs I knew, some of course I didn't. They were the politicos, the whatever. And come the end of the dinner, the most important Czech got up, said thank you very much, and started leaving. So I said to the Czechs, who I did know, well, there's no need to go, let's have another drink. Oh no, they said, if he goes, we've got to go. So that was that, so they all left. And so we had a drink without them, which I thought was a pity. What else do I remember of that? Oh yes, that's right. Ladislav Kessner told me that the British ambassador in Prague, an earlier one, was Cecil Parrott, the man who translated Zweig. And he said that, and many of you may be able to confirm this, he said that Parrott was a very, very well-known figure in Prague because he was always walking around the town reading a book. So everyone knew who he was. And I thought, well, that's what an ambassador ought to be, someone who's always around in the streets and everyone knows who he is. And it was clear that the English are very highly regarded in Prague, so that was made my life a lot more comfortable. Yes, that's right. Kessner was a man who had a very particular view of England, and his favourite book, he told me, was one I didn't know, which I subsequently got, this one, The Age of Scandal by T.H. White. And this was a sort of chronicle of Regency England and the sort of the dreadful behaviour of the grossly over-rich aristos. I mean, it didn't mean the same to me as I'd seen them all at college in Oxford, but he hadn't seen them in action. And it was, anyway, he found this absolutely wonderful, this sort of this English insouciance about losing £500,000 overnight and all the rest of it. So I got that book, and when he came to London, he stayed with us afterwards. He was delighted by some item in the news, which was a report of a lawsuit between a pop singer and the manager of the fish farm that he ran. And the judge had apparently interrupted the proceedings to ask why he was running a fish farm, and indeed, did he sing to the fish? And Kessler thought it was absolutely wonderful. It showed that the English were still as mad as they always had been. So I appreciated that. So that was good. Anyway, how am I doing for time? So that was a second exchange of collections. But there's a coda to this, which was the Blake exhibition, because in '89, of course, suddenly the Czechs could come out, and Kessner came to London. And we went to see, and my wife and I went to see them in Prague. And yes, and I remember we had dinner in their house, and Kessner had a couple of very good African figures and carved small figures, which he bought on the Portobello Road in the 60s, I suppose, when things were getting liberal and people could come out, and before it all came clammed down again. He took us round. Yes, no, he did not. But I must get this chronology right. By that stage, Kotelik had been pushed out. He was pushed out very soon after '89 because he'd been sort of sympathised with the old regime. And I shared the view of quite a lot of people that this is really grossly unfair on Kotelik, because of course he had to be a trimmer. How else could he ever have kept his job? But he had kept the National Gallery in Prague going, and he had maintained an international profile for it. It was a place that people knew. He travelled around. He spoke a lot of languages, and he had supported his staff. And I thought it was very cruel to have pushed him out. Anyway, he was. And my friend Kessner, I never knew what to call him. I should have called him Ladislav, but I didn't quite have the nerve to. So I didn't call him anything, but I'll call him Kessner for you. He was put in charge of the Prague Castle and the exhibitions there. And he came to, one time he came to London, he said, what I would really love to do in Prague is have an exhibition of William Blake. He thought that Blake was a sort of figure that the Czechs would really understand, and obviously Blake meant an awful lot to him. And apparently there'd never been a Blake exhibition in Prague. Well, by that stage I was the head of the department, and I spoke to Margaret MacLeod at the British Council, who I should say was a tower of strength throughout the whole of my dealings with Prague. And I said, well, is there any way we can manage this? Because, of course, basically I wasn't allowed to send exhibitions to Prague. This was Blake exhibitions, particularly everyone wanted Blake. And, the idea was that we were going to raise tons of lovely money by charging a huge fee to whoever took it. Well, the Czechs said didn't have lots of money. So I said, how can we do it? And Margaret solved that problem by saying, well, the Finns are desperate for an exhibition. If we charge them a lot, we can probably do a second showing in Prague. And that's what happened. So I was actually able to send a Blake exhibition to Prague for nothing but the costs of transport, which I think is probably the most extraordinary achievement of my career.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased. I don't know what it meant to anyone else in Prague, but it meant a lot to Kessner. And it was shown beautifully. And it did look very good. And the reason he liked, a reason he liked Blake so much is it reminded him of this artist, whose name I always forget. On the cover of the book, you'll know who he was. Vachal. Vachal. Yeah. Vachal was an artist, I think, almost no one outside Prague knew, rather like Bilek, and was obviously a complete misfit and an outsider and everything. So he sort of fitted the Blake category. On the other hand, I think he was an alcoholic, which Blake certainly wasn't. But anyway, it was that sort of outsiderness that appealed to Kessner. And so we, so as I say, we had this exhibition, and the reward for me and my wife was to be put up in the sort of Prague castle, in the suite of rooms which is used for visiting heads of state, which is you know, the backside of the castle, not looking onto the river, looking up the hill. Which is wonderful. It's a horrible room. Marvellous position. It was so derelict by that stage, so I think they'd given up putting any visiting dignitaries there, that half of it was fenced off with a sort of screen, so I peered behind the screen to see what was there. It was a lot of junk. It had sort of just been piled up there. It was wonderful. So that was wonderful positions, I say. And we had the opening, and I hope people went to it. I never quite knew. Anyway, so that really was the end of, yes, in my memories. Now, there was a twist. The lady who was putting together the Czech end of this was a lady called Jana Vitlichova, I think it was. Yes, Vitlich. Anyway, she's married to Vitlich, who was, may mean something to you, but apparently the great man in Czech art historical writing on the Art Nouveau period. And he'd written lots and lots of books, none of which had been translated. And I asked Kessner whether they were going to be translated, and he said no one can understand them. So I thought that was a sort of honest answer. But Vitlich came to London, so they've been very good to me in Prague. So I remember I had to take him out to see something. He wanted to see Ickworth, and I got terribly lost taking him there. But we did get there eventually. And I never worked out why he wanted to go to Ickworth, because it's the Bristol's house, full of famous collection of silver and things like that. Nothing Art Nouveau about it at all. Anyway, there we go. But that was that. But he was a remarkable man too. Now I have to say I like the Czechs enormously, and when you thought what they all had to go through, it was you really couldn't do too much for them. So, end of story. I don't know whether there's any questions.
Yes, I'm sure there are. Can I? Yes, that's fascinating. I mean, I must say, not having to sort of look at photographs, it's like just listen to you, it engages the imagination far more. I think it was very good. We have to try this format again. It's very good indeed. I was just wondering, the second exhibition where you exchanged prints, were they modern prints? Was they a collection of modern prints?
Yes, the Czech prints are all 20th century. The British prints sort of slid backwards into the 19th century. And when I say 20th century, the byline said from 1900 to 1970, and there were indeed plenty of 60s prints involved. So it did, it did cover the whole of that period. And there was about, I think, 100 prints in it. And it included some really star things. And there's one of the Czech Cubist prints by Fila, which are completely unobtainable. I don't know how they managed to get hold of it, but I think it's probably the only one outside Czechoslovakia. Anyway, we still got them, I hasten to say, and anyone can come and look at them if you want to. And maybe one of these days we'll actually get round to, my successors will get round to showing them again. But it's a good collection.
Well, what was the audience? I mean, first of all, what was the audience like in Prague in terms of numbers and
I can't tell you. I was on the plane back the next morning. You can't afford to be away from the museum too long. You never know what might be done behind your back.
Yes. So, any questions?
Can I add something parallel?
Yes, please do. Yeah. Can I give you this? Ooh.
Sorry.
If any of you have got memories to add to this, please.
Well, I'm doing this by proxy for my husband, who I think you know or knew or know quite well, Peter Cannon Brooks,
Oh, yes.
because he had parallel experiences like your own, and there were two exhibitions that came from Prague. First of all, Baroque in Bohemia in 1969, which was shown in Birmingham and the V&A. And then in 1982, the National Gallery sent a lot of late 19th and early 20th century sculpture, which fell by default because it was never advertised outside Wales. However, he did have some experiences which are perhaps sort of parallel. And one was, he was there with an exhibition. I don't remember the name of the exhibition that he was curating, but there was also on this visit Henry Moore and Kenneth Clark, and they came down the steps of the aeroplane with their Macintoshes rather bulging and a slight clanking noise. And they were received by academician Kotelik. And he said, oh, is there anything wrong with these gentlemen? And so my husband had to explain that most British people fortified themselves with the duty-free before they set off on a journey, at which Kotelik replied, do they think we're not going to look after them? And this was the occasion when the whole of the Liber Beaticus, this famous manuscript, was out for them to admire. And Henry Moore went up to the gallery of the cathedral to see the great parlour sculptures and was completely bowled over by it. And one last thing is, I did know Lada Kesner myself quite well, not as well as you. And there was one thing that always interested me. He said about his son. Well, he said he speaks English, Russian, and he's learning Chinese. So whoever gets us, he'll be all right.
The son is now a professor in Prague, and he's very, if you look up, that's the same name as the father. And if you look up on the web, you'll just see hundreds and hundreds of references to the son, nothing about the father. The son and the father had the most appalling falling out, and they would hardly speak to each other. The story I got was that the son had denounced the father in some sort of party event, which was an appalling thing to do. But anyway, do you want someone else want to say something?
Shall we use the microphone? Pass the mic. Sorry.
So, did you know anything about the history of the film that you saw in Edinburgh about the tanks that invaded, the Russian tanks? Did you know the history of that?
Well, wasn't there someone chucking it into a newspaper car, which was found when the newspaper man had left Czechoslovakia, or am I wrong?
Well, this is just a personal anecdotal story. I was working for a Czech in Houston, Texas. I was employed there provisionally, and he was an importer, steel importer of steel. That's what he did. And one day he told me, I was 19 or 20, you know, I'd like to do something for the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia at that time. I'm just going to finance a small film in Czechoslovakia. And so he put together a small group of film group. They sent them over, and they didn't know what they were going to film. But while they were trying to sort out what they were trying to film, the tanks rolled in, and so they filmed the whole Russian occupation. He then had to get, it was a sensation, of course, because he had to get the film back, which means it had to be smuggled out, came back to the United States, And I had a girlfriend at the time at the University of St. Thomas, which was a Catholic institution, but was right next to the office where I worked. And I suggested that perhaps he might want to show the film when they got it out, which he did. And the chairman of that department was Mrs. Desménil, who was part of the Schlumberger family. And she was so taken by the film that she then, it started a relationship between them where he became the chairman of the Desménil Foundation. So I think that the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes things happen because people do things for one set of purposes, find themselves in a situation that's completely different, and then it opens up a completely new chapter, and the consequence of that is that you saw that film in Edinburgh. So I just wanted to add that as an anecdotal story.
Were you involved when Václav Havel came over in the early 90s, and there was some event, I think, at Southwark Cathedral, looking at the print? Or have I got that wrong?
No, I had nothing to do with it. My involvement with Prague was simply the ones I've talked about. Southwark Cathedral, that was my brother, an architect, but I don't suppose he had anything much to do with this.
There is a plaque of Wenceslas Koller, I think, in Southwark Cathedral by Franta Bilski.
Oh, yes.
So maybe that's...
Yes, no, I had nothing to do with that. No.
Well,
Okay. So, but you weren't involved?
No, I wasn't involved, no.
Because Havel was involved.
Yes, yes, well that was a diplomatic, not a museum operation.
Over here, sorry. Sorry, I hand it over.
Thank you. Thank you, Antony. I enjoyed enormously your talk and the experiences. It brings back so much. I was very often in Czechoslovakia during those years in the 1980s, early 90s, and first as director of visiting arts in this country, and then as director of the British Council, in fact, visual arts. To start with, the memory of bottles in coats. I remember doing something in Edinburgh, and the Czech ambassador came up for it, and we were sort of smuggled out of the reception and went out to his car, and he had a package of bottles of, what's that stuff called, that Czech... Yeah, Bekarovska, that's right. Which was a sort of secret deal. I also got a gong, actually, along with David Wilson from the British Museum. It took months to get permission from the British authorities to receive it. And I showed it to a subsequent Czech ambassador here in this building. We both had a bit of a laugh about it, but of course by then the wall had fallen and so on. Kotelik I knew very well. He was, I knew him first through the Venice Biennale because he represented all the Czech artists who showed there. And he had a sort of two-edged reputation. I liked him very much. Most people shied away from him and all his colleagues from Eastern Europe, but he was a very entertaining, very erudite character, and he sat on a lot of on the opportunities that might have gone to colleagues to go abroad and travel. On the other hand, he protected them, and so it was two ways. We did an exhibition, quite an important one actually, which toured Eastern Europe in 1987, of British painting of the 1980s, and that included artists such as Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon and so on. It was probably a bit too important because it was supposed to be going to Kotelik's institution, and to our surprise, at the last moment, it ended up on the first floor of the National Library. They didn't cancel it, but it was very discreetly done. I could say not a lot, but there was, you must have had dealings with the Czech embassy at this end, I imagine, did you with the cultural councillor?
Not much, no. I think probably mainly in for the last one, when we were sending the William Blakes, and I remember dealing with some people here.
Oh, yeah.
But at that time, back in the 80s, I don't remember, but my memory is very patchy, so that doesn't mean very much. One thing your words did remind me is that when we opened one of the exhibitions in Prague, my boss came out with me, the head of the department, who I couldn't stand, and he announced that he wanted to play the organ of Prague Cathedral. I thought, what bloody nerve, you know, who does he think he is? Anyway, the Czechs took this seriously rather than telling him to get lost. And so he did indeed play the organ in Prague Cathedral. And I said to Kester, I said, how on earth did you arrange that? And he said, well, you've no idea how many debts I've incurred. So as always, you know, in real life, it's all about dealing with someone and tit for tat and scratching backs.
Yeah, I didn't want to monopolise the discussion, but I would just go on to say that I became very friendly with the Czech cultural councillor, whom some of you may have known, Zdeněk Baníček. And he was sort of constant here, and he did a huge amount to encourage exchanges between Czech artists and artists in Britain, particularly Wales for some reason. He studied the trade union movement very carefully and formed close friendships with Judge Bruce Griffiths, who is the founder of 56 Group Wales, and they exhibited also in Czechoslovakia. There were occasions when the ambassador was away, and then he would take over the embassy and he'd produce the real Czech Budweiser. You know, there's that dispute, you remember, between the authentic one and the American equivalent, which I think swamped the Czech one. And
you can't call it an equivalent, that would be very dangerous.
There's a big case. Anyway, sorry.
No, not at all. Anybody, any more questions?
It's hugely enjoyable.
Yeah, very good.
Antony, thank you.
There's one over here.
You talk about visual arts coming to the UK from the Czech Republic in the 80s, and how alert you were to the impact that had on the public. Are you aware of any of the other imports from the Czech Republic in the 80s from the cultural sector, like theatre, film, nothing at all?
No, well, I mean, that wasn't my world. I had a particular business angle, if you like, with Prague. I also had a job which was supposed to be looking after 2 million prints, and I knew nothing about them. So I have to say that my career was very, very much buried in the museum and trying to get on top of that collection, which was, if I can boast, I think we did get on top of it, because we did manage to reorganise the entire collection. And we did manage to catalogue the entire collection on the database. It's now all on the web. And that was 500,000 catalogue records we had to write from scratch. So that was a hell of a job. So that's why I'm afraid I'm a rather blinkered museum man.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should offer you a drink.
American Budweiser.